So well done for making it to the end of week 2, or sneaking ahead if that's what you've done. The question that we're facing in week 2, and indeed that we haven't finished yet with, is this: how, if at all, do your thoughts influence your perceptions? Now, in thinking about that question, we have had to spend a bit of time working on the notion of perception. And that's useful, of course, because this notion of perception is going to come up again and again and again in philosophy. So I feel like it was a good thing to do in its own right, as well as being essential for this question about thoughts influencing perception. So what have we got so far? We've got the idea from Dretske of simple seeing. That should help us to focus on a notion of perception that we can sensibly ask questions about whether our thoughts influence it or not, avoiding making the question trivial. We've also talked about perception of moving objects, the way that perceptual processes are involved in tracking those moving objects. And because perceptual processes receive only incomplete information, we recognise that perception is partly a process of filling in missing details. And of course, if you're going to fill in missing details, then you need some kind of principles or theory-like structure governing the way that objects behave. Simple idea. You're able to track moving objects even though they are often invisible to you, for example, because they've moved behind a barrier. You're able to do that because your perceptual processes depend on certain principles about the way that objects behave. For example, the idea that objects tend to move on spatiotemporally continuous paths. Very good. Why is that relevant to us? Well, it allows us then to put the question in this way. The question about whether your thoughts influence your perceptions is really the question of the principles, theories, whatever, that your perceptual processes depend on to fill in missing information. Can that include just anything that you believe or know, or are there some hard limits? Are the principles that govern your perceptual abilities principles that are in some sense proprietary to perception and separate from your beliefs? This is the question of cognitive penetration. Now, we've also looked, we haven't answered that question yet, that's very important, we haven't answered that question yet, but we have looked at why it's significant. And I suggested to you it's significant for two things. It's significant for understanding how observations relate to theories, which will be an important theme later. It's also significant for understanding whether we should accept what I'm calling the acquaintance view, the view that all thought, depends fundamentally on acquaintance. In order to be thinking about an object, you have to be either acquainted with that object, or you have to know the object by description, where eventually everything that goes into that description must rest on acquaintance. There may be further descriptions, but eventually you're going to bottom out at acquaintance. Should we accept the acquaintance view? What I've suggested is this. If it turns out that thoughts can fluidly and generally affect perceptual processes, that there isn't really a boundary between thought and perception of any theoretical interest, then we shouldn't necessarily think as observations straightforwardly refuting theories in the way that they are classically supposed to do, nor can we accept the acquaintance view because we can no longer think of perception, the paradigm case of acquaintance, as something more basic than thought that explains the possibility of it. So the answer to our question about whether thoughts influence perceptions matters for these two reasons. But we've seen more than that. We've also seen, and I thought this was important and useful to do, that there is an alternative to the acquaintance view, which is linked to an alternative to classical views about observations refuting theories, and that alternative is provided by pragmatist theories. Now, I'm not endorsing the pragmatist theories any more than I'm endorsing the acquaintance view. All I'm suggesting, I think uncontroversially, is that we have two coherent alternative theories. What we need to do for our next steps is to try to find some considerations that can rationally move us one way or another. It's no good to do philosophy by just picking a side and going for it. Philosophy isn't just a matter of opinion. We want some good, solid reasons that can take us one way or another here, assuming that the matter can be decided at all. So we have to, I'm suggesting, the key to understanding these rather deep issues that have been with us through a lot of the history of philosophy, is to grapple now that we've understood it with this question: how, if at all, do your thoughts influence your perceptions? Our next step will be to try to find evidence for the view that thoughts basically don't influence perceptions in any direct way, and evidence against that view, evidence for the view that your thought penetrates your perception, and so there isn't any theoretically deep distinction between thought and perception to be had at all. So those are our next steps. This is the question that we're working on, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in some more lectures next week. Thank you very much.